Imagine being on a billionaire's yacht, surrounded by the world's richest and most powerful. And then, right in front of everyone, someone looks at Steve Harvey and says, "Do you even belong here?" The crowd froze. The insult cut deep, but what Steve said next didn't just silence the guest. It left the entire party stunned and reminded everyone what true success really means. The night was flawless, the kind of evening that felt more like a scene from a Hollywood film than real life. The billionaire's yacht sparkled under the glow of golden lights, gliding smoothly across the ocean like a floating palace. The waves shimmered with reflections of the moon, and the salty breeze carried laughter and the faint sound of a jazz band playing softly in the background. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with wealth and power. The deck was filled with some of the most influential people in the world. A-list celebrities in glittering gowns, CEOs in crisp tailored suits, and heirs of family empires casually sipping champagne as if it were water. Conversations floated through the air, talk of billion-dollar deals, exotic vacations, and exclusive investments that most people could only dream about. And then there was Steve Harvey. When he stepped onto the yacht, heads turned. Some greeted him with wide smiles, admiring the man who had entertained millions with his humor and wit. Others, however, exchanged whispers behind champagne glasses. In this world of inherited fortunes and corporate dynasties, Steve stood out. He wasn't born into privilege, nor did he rise through the traditional ranks of Wall Street or business empires. His empire was built on laughter, resilience, and sheer determination. Steve felt it instantly, the unspoken judgment in the air. Some guests looked at him as though he didn't quite belong. He knew the look well. He had seen it throughout his career. But Steve Harvey wasn't the kind of man to shrink back. He put on that famous smile, shook hands with confidence, and filled the air with his booming laughter. Within minutes, he had a small circle around him, hanging onto his jokes and stories. His charisma was magnetic, the kind that could light up any room no matter how stiff or cold the company. Even the waitstaff chuckled as they passed by, carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. But beneath the surface of all the glitz and glamour, a quiet tension lingered. In a world where wealth defined status, there were always a few who couldn't resist testing someone like Steve. The yacht rocked gently as the night deepened, the crowd breaking off into small groups. Some retreated to the upper deck to admire the ocean view, while others remained inside, dancing and laughing. Steve continued to mingle, his presence warm and lively, but there was an edge in the air that he couldn't quite ignore. And then, as he stood near the railing with a group of guests, enjoying the ocean breeze and swapping stories, it happened. One man, tall, impeccably dressed, his confidence dripping with the arrogance of old money, turned to Steve with a smirk that could slice through glass. He raised his voice just enough to draw the attention of others nearby. The words that left his mouth would shift the tone of the evening entirely, sparking a moment no one on that yacht would ever forget. The evening breeze grew cooler as the yacht drifted further into open water. Conversations blended with the faint hum of the engines. Glasses clinked and laughter echoed under the stars. On the deck's edge, a small circle of guests had formed, their attention drawn naturally toward Steve Harvey, who had a way of making any group feel alive. He was in his element, telling a story about his early career struggles, mixing humor with wisdom in a way only Steve could. People leaned in, smiling, chuckling, nodding along. For a moment, the invisible walls of wealth and status seemed to melt away. Steve wasn't just a celebrity here. He was a man connecting with people. And then, it happened. From within the group, a tall man shifted his champagne glass from one hand to the other, his smirk growing as if he'd been waiting for the perfect moment. He was known not for his own accomplishments, but for the empire his grandfather had built. His money spoke louder than his actions, and tonight he decided it was his turn to speak. With a voice that cut through the laughter, he said, "This isn't a comedy club, Steve. Do you even belong here? People on this yacht actually built something." The words dropped like a stone in still water. The crowd froze. For a second, nobody moved. A couple of nervous chuckles escaped, not because the insult was funny, but because people didn't know how else to react. A few guests turned their heads, suddenly fascinated by the horizon. Others lowered their glasses, embarrassed by the blatant disrespect. Steve's smile faltered just slightly, as the sting of the comment settled in. To the arrogant guest, it may have been nothing more than a jab, a cheap attempt to establish superiority. But to Steve, it was personal. Because Steve had built something, not an empire of old money passed down through generations. Not a business funded by privilege and connections, but a career born from struggle, grit, and relentless faith. He remembered the nights he slept in his car, too broke to afford a motel. He remembered the days of rejection, when bookers and producers told him he wasn't good enough, when audiences walked out, when he questioned if his dream was even worth it. He remembered the taste of hunger, the humiliation of failure, and the heavy silence of doubt, and now, here he was, a man who had fought tooth and nail to create a legacy of laughter, inspiration, and success. Yet in this glittering circle of the ultra-wealthy, someone dared to question if he belonged. The music in the background carried on, but the energy around the group shifted. The insult lingered in the salty night air, sharp and undeniable. Some guests braced for laughter, hoping Steve would turn it into a joke. Others expected him to explode in anger to clap back with the fire he was known for. But Steve Harvey didn't move. His eyes fixed on the man, steady and unflinching. The smile was gone now, replaced by something far stronger, resolve. The stage was set. Everyone knew they were about to witness a moment that would define the entire evening. Steve didn't react right away. He simply drew in a long, deliberate breath and gently set his champagne glass on the nearest table. The crystal clinked softly, barely audible over the hum of the music, yet somehow that small action commanded attention. Every eye turned toward him. He scanned the circle, faces frozen in expectation. Some looked entertained, waiting for drama. Others looked tense, wishing the confrontation would just pass. And then there were a few, genuinely curious to see how Steve Harvey, the man who built a career out of words, would use them now. The guest who had mocked him leaned back with smug satisfaction, swirling his drink as though he had already won. His smirk widened, convinced Steve would either laugh it off or stumble for a comeback. But Steve knew something the man didn't. Silence could speak louder than any insult. And tonight silence was his weapon, seconds stretched like minutes. The waves lapped softly against the yacht, and the muffled rhythm of jazz floated in the background. The tension was thick, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Finally, Steve straightened his shoulders, his voice calm but strong, carrying across the deck with the kind of authority that comes not from money or power, but from lived experience. "You asked me if I belong here," he began, locking eyes with the man. "Let me tell you something. I wasn't born into privilege. I wasn't handed a company. I wasn't given a trust fund. Everything I have, I built." The smirk on the man's face faltered slightly. A hush rippled through the circle. Steve continued, his tone steady, unwavering. "When I was chasing my dream, I slept in my car. I was broke, hungry, rejected more times than I can count. But I didn't quit. I worked, I prayed. I got back up every time life knocked me down. And eventually, I built a career that has blessed me beyond what I could have imagined." He paused, letting the words sink in. His eyes scanned the group now, not just the man who insulted him. "So, when you say the people on this yacht built something, you're right. But don't you ever get it twisted, I built something too. I built it without the safety net of old money. I built it out of struggle, sacrifice, and faith." The crowd was silent, captivated. Even the music seemed distant, like the yacht itself was holding its breath. Steve leaned in just slightly, his voice firm but measured. "And the difference between me and you? I know what it feels like to have nothing. That's why I will never use my success to belittle someone else." The arrogant guest shifted uncomfortably, his smugness slipping away. For the first time, his confidence cracked. Steve stepped back, reclaiming his glass from the table with quiet grace. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to insult back. His words had already landed harder than any punch. Around him, the silence was heavy, the kind that followed truth spoken plainly and powerfully. Steve Harvey had answered the insult not with anger, but with dignity. And in that moment, the entire party felt the weight of his reply. Steve's voice rolled over the deck, calm but commanding. A tone that made even the chatter and music from the other side of the yacht fade into silence. The jazz band still played, but somehow the notes seemed distant, insignificant compared to the gravity of the moment. "You're right," he said, eyes locked on the man who had mocked him. His tone wasn't sharp but steady, the kind of voice that came from a man who had lived what he was saying. "I'm not a banker. I don't own an oil field. I didn't inherit a company. But let me tell you what I did build. The crowd instinctively leaned in closer, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Even the night breeze seemed to pause. I built a life out of nothing, Steve continued. I built myself when I had no home, no money, and no hope. I built a career after being told 1,000 times that I wasn't funny enough, not smart enough, not good enough. I built opportunities for people who had none, because I remember what it felt like to have doors slammed in my face. And if you think that's not building something, then you don't understand what success really is. The words hit like thunder. The arrogant guest shifted uncomfortably, his smirk now gone, his face stiff. For the first time that evening, the man's confidence wavered. Around them, people shuffled, guilt flashing in their eyes. A few guests lowered their heads, embarrassed not only by the man's insult, but by their own silence. Steve didn't stop there. He turned slightly, addressing not just the man, but everyone gathered. You see, success isn't measured by the size of your yacht or the weight of your bank account. Success is measured by how many times you get knocked down and still get back up. Success is when you turn pain into purpose. Success is when you lift others up instead of pushing them down. A hush fell over the group. Some nodded slowly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to deep respect. Others blinked as if seeing Steve Harvey, not the comedian, not the TV host, but the man, for the very first time. And through it all, Steve never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His truth was louder than any insult could ever be. The ocean breeze carried his words into the night air, and for a long moment no one dared to speak. The only sound was the soft splash of waves against the yacht's hull. The man who had mocked him now looked small, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of Steve's dignity. Finally, one guest broke the silence. A quiet clap. Then another. Within seconds, the circle around Steve erupted into applause. Not the shallow kind given at fancy events, but the genuine kind, full of admiration and respect. Even those who had looked away earlier now clapped, their eyes wide with something like shame, something like awe. Steve smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of peace. He had said what needed to be said, and in that moment, on a billionaire's yacht under the glow of the moon, Steve Harvey didn't just belong. He stood above them all. For a moment, the deck was completely silent. The music played on, but it felt far away, drowned out by the weight of Steve's words. The crowd stood frozen, caught between shock and admiration as if time itself had paused on the billionaire's yacht. Then, from the back of the circle, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant at first, but the sound cut through the stillness like a spark in dry wood. Another guest joined in, then another. Within seconds, the applause spread across the deck like wildfire. The quiet had been broken, replaced by a wave of admiration louder than the music itself. People who had looked away earlier now stood tall, clapping with conviction, their eyes fixed on Steve Harvey. Some smiled in awe, others nodded as if silently thanking him for saying what they themselves had always wanted to say. It wasn't just applause for a celebrity. It was respect for a man who had spoken a truth that resonated far beyond wealth and status. Even the billionaire hosting the party stepped forward, his polished shoes tapping softly on the deck. He reached out, shaking Steve's hand with both of his own. His words, though simple, carried a weight the crowd couldn't ignore. Now that's the kind of success money can't buy. The applause grew louder, echoing across the open sea. The very yacht that had moments earlier been filled with tension and arrogance was now alive with respect. The man who had tried to humiliate Steve shifted in the background, shrinking into the shadows. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness. He had expected laughter at Steve's expense, but instead he had sparked a lesson that left him exposed. Steve didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or savor the man's humiliation. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he smiled softly, humbled but steady, and raised his voice once more, this time not to one man, but to everyone on the yacht. "Never let anyone measure your worth with their yardstick," he said, his words carrying over the applause until the deck quieted again. "Success isn't about where you party. It's about where you started and how far you've come." The crowd erupted again, this time with cheers mixed into the clapping. Guests leaned closer to Steve, eager to shake his hand, to exchange a few words with the man who had just redefined success in front of their eyes. That night, Steve Harvey didn't just stand his ground. He reminded everyone present, billionaires, celebrities, and elites alike, of a truth far greater than yachts, champagne, or inherited fortunes. Respect isn't purchased with money. It's earned through struggle, perseverance, and dignity. And the man who thought he could humiliate Steve Harvey? He learned the hardest lesson of all. You can't mock someone who has already built themselves from the ground up. On that glittering deck under the moonlit sky, Steve Harvey didn't just belong, and he owned the moment. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful and inspiring stories. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.